The word hit Jane Slater like a closed fist across the jaw. Pity. She had not heard Rancher Bellows say it directly to her face, because men like Gerald Bellows never had the spine for that kind of honesty. He had said it to his foreman, Hank Dutton, while standing not 15 feet from where Jane knelt in the red Oklahoma dust, pretending to examine the split leather on her saddle bag. She had gone still the moment she heard her name, and she heard every syllable that followed with the terrible, crystalline clarity of a woman who had learned to survive by listening. "Give her something light to do," Bellows had murmured, low and deliberate. "Mucking stalls or mending fences on the East End where nobody sees her. Poor creature lost everything. It would be unkind not to offer. Besides, folks in town are watching how we treat her." Folks in town are watching, not because Jane Slater was capable, not because her hands knew the weight of a rope and the resistance of a stubborn calf, not because she had ridden through 3 blizzards alongside her late husband Cole, had helped brand 200 head of cattle in a single July afternoon, had kept their small ranch solvent through a drought that drove 4 neighboring families off their land. None of that. The offer was theater. A performance of Christian charity for the benefit of an audience that had already made up its collective mind about what Jane Slater was now that Cole was 6 months in the ground and the bank had taken everything. She was a widow. She was 26 years old. And in 1882 in Caldwell, Kansas, those 2 facts together meant that every offer of work was wrapped in the suffocating wool of sympathy rather than the clean linen of genuine need. Jane stood up from the dust. She kept her face empty, which she had also learned to do, and she thanked Gerald Bellows with the same composed, unreadable expression she had worn at Cole's funeral, when half the town had told her she was too young and too pretty to stay grieving forever, as though grief operated on a schedule that others could set for her. She took her saddle bag, walked to her horse, a lean red roan mare she had named Ada, and she rode away from the Bellows ranch without the job and without the pity. That was the 4th ranch in 9 days. The Bennett spread had come first, old Thomas Bennett offering her a cook's position, his eyes soft and swimming with that particular brand of condescension that men wore when they believed they were being generous. She had cooked for herself and Cole for 6 years, and she knew her way around a kitchen. But she also knew that Thomas Bennett had 2 perfectly capable women already working his kitchen, and the offer existed only because his wife Martha had likely nudged him into it during Sunday supper. Then Rancher Holt, who ran the largest cattle operation east of the Arkansas River, had suggested she might like to sit in his office and handle correspondence, though he had 3 men already performing that function, and the suggestion had been delivered with such elaborate delicacy that Jane felt like a porcelain doll being handled by hands that expected her to shatter. The 3rd had been worse. Clyde Marsh, who Jane had never liked even when Cole was alive, had offered her what he called a position managing the household affairs of his ranch, which in plain language meant housekeeping, laundering, and cooking for 14 ranch hands, at a wage so slight it would barely cover her rent at Mrs. Parrish's boarding house. When she had asked whether the wage was negotiable, Marsh had looked at her the way men look at something small that has overstepped its bounds, and the conversation had ended there. 4 ranchers. 4 offers wrapped in the same bruising, invisible message. You are broken. You are helpless. We are being good people by not leaving you entirely destitute. Jane rode Ada back along the road that curved between the cottonwoods toward town, and she let herself feel the anger because anger was cleaner than despair and she could not afford despair. She had $11.40 left. She owed Mrs. Parrish for 2 weeks' lodging. Ada needed new shoes, and winter, though still months away in the August heat, was not a rumor. It would come as it always came, indifferent and absolute. She pulled Ada to a stop at the top of the small rise that looked down on Caldwell's Main Street, the clapboard storefronts and the dust, and the men moving between the hitching posts with the purposeful, unhurried gait of people who belonged somewhere. She sat there for a long moment, her jaw tight, her hands quiet on the reins. It was Ada who moved first, tossing her head and sidling slightly, and Jane followed the mare's gaze west along the ridge road. She had not previously paid much attention to the Crawford ranch, which sat 5 miles out past the town's western edge on land that rose gently toward a low line of hills. She knew the name. Timothy Crawford had come to Caldwell 3 years ago from somewhere in Texas, had bought the old Harmon property when old Sam Harmon's lungs finally gave out, had built it up steadily and quietly without making a spectacle of himself. Cole had mentioned him once or twice as a man who did things properly. Jane had seen him twice at the general store, a tall man, dark-haired, probably 29 or 30, with a particular kind of self-containment that either meant pride or genuine peace, and she had never had reason to determine which. She had not been to the Crawford ranch. It had not been on her list because someone, she could not remember who, had mentioned that Timothy Crawford ran a small operation and probably had no room for additional hands. But she was out of options, and the morning was not yet gone, and she was not ready to go back to that small room at Mrs. Parrish's and sit with her $11.40 and her diminishing options. So she turned Ada west. The Crawford ranch was not small. That was the first thing she registered as she came over the rise, and the property spread itself out below her in the morning light, and something shifted in her chest that might have been surprise or might have been irritation at having been misinformed. The main house was a solid 2-story timber structure, not elaborate but built with clear attention to permanence. There were 2 long barns, a bunkhouse, a well-maintained corral with 8 horses working in easy circles, and beyond the corral, far enough that they were moving specks in the distance, she could see cattle on the hillside grass. It was not the largest spread in the county, but it was a genuine working ranch, efficiently organized, with the particular quality of order that comes not from having a great deal of money but from paying close attention to what you have. She rode down the slope toward the main gate. A man was working at the corral fence when she came through the gate, replacing a rail with the focused economy of someone who has done this particular job many times and does not need to think about it. He looked up when he heard Ada's hooves on the hard ground, and Jane recognized Timothy Crawford, though she had not realized until this moment how precisely she remembered his face from those 2 brief encounters at the general store. He was perhaps 30, she revised slightly, or close to it. The self-containment she had noticed before was present here too, but in the context of his own land and his own work it read differently. It read like certainty. He set down his hammer and walked toward her with a straightforward directness that was neither hurried nor slow, just a man covering ground between himself and a visitor, because that was the appropriate thing to do. "Mrs. Slater," he said, and the fact that he knew her name without any performance of recognition, without the elaborate careful sympathy that everyone else in Caldwell attached to it like a black ribbon, was already different. "What can I do for you?" Jane had rehearsed this on the ride over. She had been practicing the pitch since the morning of her first rejection, refining it, trimming the apology from the edges of it, because she had discovered that her instinct under pressure was to apologize for taking up space, and she was working against that instinct with deliberate effort. "I'm looking for work," she said. "Ranch work. I can ride, I can rope, I can brand, I can mend fence, I can manage cattle movement, I can keep accounts. I have 6 years of working a cattle operation. I'm not looking for charity, and I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking whether you have work that needs doing, and whether you want someone capable of doing it." The words came out level and clear, exactly as she had practiced them, and she watched his face for the softening, for the careful rearrangement of features that preceded pity, for the slight dropping of the eyes that meant a man was already composing a gentle refusal wrapped in concern. Timothy Crawford's face did none of those things. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was, as best she could read it, simply thoughtful, not performing consideration, not calibrating an excuse. "Actually thinking. My head foreman's wife had their first child 3 weeks ago," he said. "He's been splitting his attention and it's showing. I've got 120 head that need moving to the north pasture before the end of the week, and I'm 2 riders short. I also have accounts going back to March that haven't been reconciled, and I've been putting it off because I hate the work." He paused. "What did you pay yourself on your own spread?" she told him. He named a figure 10% higher. Jane was so prepared for a different kind of conversation that she took a second too long to respond. And Timothy Crawford, noticing this, said, "If that's not agreeable, I'm open to discussion." "It's agreeable," she said, and her voice came out slightly rougher than she intended because something in her chest had gone tight in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the particular, unexpected dignity of being offered a thing by someone who simply wanted the work done. She did not know yet, in that first moment, that this man and this place would become the architecture of a new life. She did not know that the straightforward transaction of that morning would unspool into something she had not allowed herself to imagine since the day she had stood at Cole's grave in the November cold, and understood that the shape of her future had changed entirely. She did not know that Timothy Crawford carried his own hidden weight, his own dark past, his own secrets that would test everything before they arrived at anything like peace. She only knew that he had spoken to her as though she were exactly what she had said she was, a capable person who needed work. And in 1882 in Caldwell, Kansas, that was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything. Jane started at the Crawford Ranch the following Monday. She had spent the intervening days settling her accounts with Mrs. Parrish, who had expressed a very particular kind of concern about a widow woman working on a bachelor rancher's property that Jane had chosen not to engage with, and reorganizing the limited contents of her trunk. She kept her room at the boarding house, at least for now, because whatever Timothy Crawford's intentions were, she was not going to assume anything about this arrangement beyond what had been plainly stated. The first morning was an exercise in calibration. She arrived before 6, which she knew from her years with Cole was when ranch work properly began, and she found the bunkhouse already active and the hands eating at the long table in the cookhouse adjacent to the main barn. There were 7 men, and they received her with a range of responses that she catalogued with the quiet efficiency she applied to most new situations. 2 of them, older hands with the weathered expressions of men who had seen stranger things than a woman showing up at their breakfast table, simply nodded and went back to their food. 2 more exchanged a glance that said more than they intended about their skepticism. One, a young man of perhaps 20 with an open, freckled face, who introduced himself as Pete Ardmore, grinned at her with what appeared to be genuine welcome. The remaining 2 watched with a neutral wariness that she suspected would resolve itself one way or another, based entirely on whether she could actually do the job. The foreman, whose name was Bill Kessler, was a compact, serious man of about 40 who shook her hand with the same pragmatic directness his employer had shown, and told her she would start with the cattle drive to the north pasture today, and the accounts later in the week. He did not explain or justify this allocation of tasks. He spoke to her the same way he spoke to Pete Ardmore standing beside her, and she appreciated this more than she could have explained to anyone who had not spent the previous 2 weeks drowning in elaborately constructed gentleness. Timothy Crawford came to the cookhouse as she was finishing her coffee. He nodded at his men, accepted a cup of coffee himself, and said to Jane directly, "Kessler will show you the north pasture route. The herd's been restless, so we'll take it slow. Any questions before you head out?" "None," she said. He nodded as though this were the expected and correct answer, and that was the whole of their exchange. He rode out later to the south end of the property on some other business, and Jane spent the morning in the saddle alongside Kessler and Pete Ardmore, moving 120 head of cattle through the low-lying eastern meadow toward the broader north pasture. And it was hard, and it was hot, and Ada proved herself exactly as capable as Jane had always believed her to be, cutting off straying cattle with a sharp intelligence that drew a comment of genuine admiration from Bill Kessler, who was not apparently a man who gave compliments carelessly. By midday, she had covered enough ground to understand the basic geography of the Crawford operation. By afternoon, she had identified two inefficiencies in the way they were managing the cattle movement that she kept to herself, because she had been here one day, and she was not fool enough to offer unsolicited restructuring advice on her first afternoon. She filed the observations away for later, when she had earned the right to make them. She was recoiling a rope at the fence line in the late afternoon when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to find Timothy Crawford returning from the south end of the property. He pulled his horse up short when he reached her and looked at the settled cattle behind her and then at her. "How did they move?" he asked. "They have a tendency to bunch at the creek crossing," she said. "We lost about 40 minutes getting them through. If you ride the lead animals across first and hold them on the far bank, the rest follow without the bunching." He looked at her for a moment. "You've seen that before. Our creek was narrower, but the behavior is the same." He nodded slowly, looking at the herd. "I'll tell Kessler." "I can tell him," she said. "It's not a criticism of how he ran it today. It's just something I noticed." Something passed through Timothy Crawford's expression that she could not immediately name. Something that was not quite surprise and not quite approval, but lived in the territory between them. "All right," he said simply. "Tell him." She did that evening at the end of the workday, and Kessler listened without defensiveness and said he would try it Thursday when they moved the remaining 40 head. It worked on Thursday. Kessler mentioned it without ceremony at the end of that day, saying only, "The crossing went faster," which Jane understood was his version of significant praise. The accounts, when she finally turned to them the following week, were not in disaster, but they were not in order either. Timothy Crawford had been recording expenses but not reconciling them against his bank ledger, and there were 3 months of feed purchases, equipment costs, and wages that existed on separate papers and had never been brought into alignment. She spent 2 days sorting through them at the small desk in the corner of his office, which was a spare, functional room off the main house with a window that looked west toward the hills. He came in and out while she worked, conducting his own business with the same quiet purposefulness she was beginning to recognize as simply the texture of how he operated. On the second afternoon, he brought her coffee without asking, set it on the desk corner without interrupting her concentration, and went back to whatever he had been doing. She noticed the gesture precisely because of its thoughtfulness and its lack of performance. He had noticed she was working. He had thought she might want coffee. He had provided it without ceremony or commentary. It was so unlike the elaborate consideration she had received from the other ranchers, so unlike the performing of goodness, that she found herself staring at the coffee cup for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. On Friday of her second week, she placed the completed accounts on his desk, reconciled and annotated, with a brief note identifying 2 places where he had been overcharged by suppliers, and 1 place where an invoice had been paid twice. He looked at the work without speaking for a moment, then looked at her, and she saw in his expression something she had not seen directed at herself in a very long time: straightforward professional respect. Not gratitude colored by surprise, not approval flavored with condescension, just the clean recognition of competent work done by a competent person. "This took me 3 times as long when I did it myself," he said. "And I missed both of those overcharges. The second one is subtle," she said. "The dates are close and the vendor name is abbreviated differently on each invoice. Thank you, Mrs. Slater." "Jane," she said, and then was briefly surprised at herself for offering it. He accepted it without making anything of it. "Jane," he said simply. She walked home to Mrs. Parrish's that evening and found herself turning the whole exchange over in her mind with an attention that was not entirely professional, and she recognized this and told herself firmly to leave it alone. She was an employee. He was her employer. She had come to him because she needed work and he had given it to her, and the arrangement was mutually beneficial and clean, and she was not going to muddy clean water. She had been muddying it in her thoughts for 3 weeks when Bill Kessler's wife Emma came to the ranch. Emma Kessler was a bright, warm woman of about 35, newly recovered from the difficult first weeks with their baby son, and she came to return a pot she had borrowed from the cookhouse and stayed to share coffee with Jane in the mid-morning quiet between tasks. Jane had not had a genuine conversation with another woman since before Cole died, and she had not realized until Emma sat down across from her just how much she had missed it. They talked for 2 hours. About the ranch, about Caldwell, about Emma's son Daniel who slept through anything and screamed at nothing. About Jane's years with Cole on their small spread, which Jane found she could speak about now with a kind of steady, honest grief rather than the raw, incapacitating sorrow of the early months. About what it was like to be a woman working a cattle ranch in Kansas in 1882, which Emma found both admirable and slightly frightening, and Jane found simply necessary. At some point Emma said carefully, "Timothy's not what people in town say about him, you know." Jane looked at her. "What do people say about him?" "Oh, the usual things people say about a man who keeps to himself, that he's cold, that he's hiding something." Emma shrugged. "He's private, there's a difference." "What happened before he came here?" Jane asked, and then wondered if the question was too direct, but Emma shook her head gently. "That's his to tell. I'll only say that he had reason to become careful, and not much reason to stop being it, until recently." She said the last 2 words with a particular quietness that Jane chose not to examine too closely. She examined it in the privacy of her own thoughts later, though. She could not help it. She had begun to notice small things about Timothy Crawford with the involuntary attention of someone who has decided not to notice a thing, and is therefore noticing it more acutely than ever. She noticed that he was unfailingly fair in his dealings with his hands, not performatively fair, not making a show of his even-handedness, but genuinely consistent in a way that the men clearly respected without needing to discuss. She noticed that he read in the evenings. She had seen the lamplight in his office window when she passed the main house on her way out, and she noticed the kind of books he left on the corner of his desk, history mostly, and one collection of poetry by Longfellow that she had picked up one afternoon purely on instinct and replaced quickly when she heard him coming. She noticed that he never spoke about himself unless directly asked, and that when he was asked, he answered with a directness that was neither evasive nor revealing, as though he had learned to be truthful about the surface of things while keeping the interior carefully sealed. The thing about sealed interiors, Jane had learned in her years, was that you could usually tell they were there. You could see the outline of whatever was locked away by the shape of the wall built around it. She was at the fence line on the eastern edge of the property in the 4th week of her employment when the secret revealed itself, not gently, not privately, but with the aggressive suddenness of things that have been held under pressure too long. A man rode onto the Crawford property at mid-afternoon, while Jane was working a section of broken fence alongside Pete Ardmore. He was a broad, red-faced man on a solid bay horse, and she would have taken him for any ordinary passing traveler except that Pete Ardmore went still the moment he saw him in a way that was not ordinary at all. The man rode past without stopping, heading toward the main house, and Pete watched him go with an expression that was difficult to read, something between unease and a careful blankness. "Who is that?" Jane asked. "Garrett Sloane," Pete said, and offered nothing else. Jane went back to work, but she was listening, the way she had trained herself to listen, and she heard raised voices from the direction of the main house perhaps 20 minutes later, sharp and brief, and then suddenly cut off. When she came in at the end of the day, Timothy was not in the office or the cookhouse or the corral, and the bay horse was gone. She found out what she could from what was available to her, which was not much, only a name and an attitude. But she turned the name over in her mind that evening, and on Saturday when she rode into Caldwell for supplies, she stopped at the dry goods store where the owner, Albert Finch, had an encyclopedic knowledge of the county and a weakness for conversation, and she let him talk. She had learned that allowing Albert Finch to talk was one of the most efficient ways of gathering information in a 20-mile radius. The name Garrett Sloane, it turned out, was not unfamiliar in Caldwell. He was a land speculator from Texas, which was where Timothy Crawford had also come from, and the two men had a history that Albert described with the relish of someone who had been waiting for someone to ask. 3 years ago, before Timothy bought the Harmon property, he had been partnered with Sloan in a small cattle operation near Abilene. The partnership had dissolved badly, with accusations of fraud on Sloan's part, accusations that had gone to a county court and been resolved in Crawford's favor, but not without significant cost to him in both money and reputation. Sloan had since made a habit of appearing periodically in whatever county Crawford settled in and making himself unpleasant. Unpleasant how? Jane asked, reaching for a bolt of plain cotton fabric she did not actually need. Legal harassment mostly, Finch said. False claims on property lines, challenges to cattle ownership, that sort of thing. Nothing that's ever stuck, but it costs Crawford time and legal fees every time. He paused. Some folks in town took it as evidence of guilt on Crawford's part, the idea being that where there's smoke there's fire and all that. And the court found in Crawford's favor, Jane said. It did, Finch said, but you know how people are. She knew how people were. She had been on the receiving end of how people were for 6 months. She rode back to the Crawford ranch that afternoon with a different quality of understanding about the man she was working for, and she was aware that this understanding had complicated the project of not thinking about him in ways that were not strictly professional. Knowing that he had survived a calculated attempt to destroy him, that he had rebuilt himself carefully and competently in a new place, under the casual suspicion of people who believed where there's smoke there's fire, created in her chest an uncomfortable recognition. She knew what it was to have people decide what your story was before you had told it. She did not tell him that she knew. It was not her information to reference. But on Monday morning when she arrived at the ranch and found him at the corral fence again, working on a different section of rails with the same methodical focus, she said, "If you need the accounts reviewed in relation to any property line claims, I can do that. I'm good at identifying the kind of documentation that holds up in court." He turned to look at her, and she watched him process the implication of the offer, the understanding it revealed, and she saw something move across his face that was neither comfortable nor simple. Not anger at the knowledge that she had gathered this information, not embarrassment, not the kind of stiff pride that would refuse the offer out of stubbornness. Something more complicated than any of those things. "Thank you," he said after a moment. "I'll let you know if it comes to that." She nodded and went to saddle Ada. The 5th week was when things shifted. It was a Thursday evening, and she had stayed late with the accounts because a discrepancy she had found late in the afternoon was bothering her, and she wanted to resolve it before the week ended. The ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse. Kessler had ridden home to Emma and the baby. The main house was quiet except for the lamp in the office where she worked, and she gradually became aware. The lamp in the adjacent sitting room where Timothy Crawford had settled sometime after 7. She found the discrepancy and resolved it. She made a note. She was tidying the papers on the desk when she knocked over the ceramic cup that held her pencils, and it made a loud crash in the evening quiet, and she swore, softly but genuinely, and then was immediately aware that she had sworn out loud in her employer's house. She heard him laugh. It was a short sound, surprised out of him, she thought, not performed, and it transformed the silence of the house so completely that she sat for a moment listening to the echo of it. She had not heard him laugh before. In 5 weeks she had heard him be wry once or twice, and she had seen what she thought was suppressed amusement around the edges of his expression during a particularly complicated situation with a stuck gate that had required 3 men and considerable creative profanity to resolve. But this was actual laughter, unguarded and genuine, and it had been generated by her, and she was sitting at his desk feeling absurdly warm about it. She collected the pencils. She organized the papers. She stood up, put on her jacket, and went to tell him she was leaving for the evening. He was sitting in the wing-back chair by the fire, the Longfellow open on his knee, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and his expression was the most open she had seen it. "You're still here," he said, and there was nothing in it except the straightforward acknowledgement of fact and perhaps a slight quality of being pleased. "I found the discrepancy," she said. "It was a feed purchase from March that got filed under April, throws the monthly totals off. I've corrected it." "You didn't have to stay for that." "I know," she said. "I wanted to close it out." He looked at her for a moment with that particular quality of attention she had begun to recognize as his version of speaking, the moments when he said things without words because he was careful with the words themselves. "Have you eaten?" he said. She had not, as it happened. She had been going to stop at Mrs. Parrish's for the late supper. "There's cold chicken in the kitchen," he said. "Mrs. Aldridge leaves it on Thursdays." She should have declined. She knew she should have declined, and she knew why she should have declined, and she also knew that she was not going to decline, and that this was a meaningful moment in the slow, complicated progression of something she had been trying not to name. She sat in the kitchen and ate cold chicken and cornbread, and Timothy Crawford sat across from her, and they talked for 2 hours. He told her about Texas, not the parts about Sloan, not the betrayal or the court or the dark year that followed, but the parts before it, the way the land looked in the early morning light and the particular quality of silence out on the open range at night. She told him about her parents' farm in Missouri, before she had moved to Kansas with coal, and the river that ran along the back of their property that she had always meant to go back to see and had not yet managed to do. They talked about cattle and about horses, and about the accounts, and about the winter that was coming in 3 months and what it typically did to the north pasture. They talked about books, and when she said she had seen the Longfellow on his desk, he did not perform any embarrassment about being caught reading poetry, and she liked him considerably for it. She rode back to Mrs. Parrish's in the dark, which she was perfectly capable of doing because she had Ada and a clear sky and 6 years of navigating the Kansas dark, and she arrived at her room and sat on the edge of her bed and said out loud, to no one, "This is not a professional complication. This is an actual problem." She said this because she was a practical person, and because practical people named their problems accurately. The problem was that she was 26 years old and 8 months a widow, and she was falling in love with her employer in 1882 in Kansas, where a widow with no property and a recent history of charity offer rejections, falling in love with the most self-contained and privately wounded man in the county, was precisely the kind of situation that ended in one of 2 ways, and only one of those ways was good. She resolved to be professional. She maintained this resolution for approximately 6 days. What broke it was not a dramatic moment. It was, in fact, a small one, which she would later think was appropriate because the large things between her and Timothy Crawford had always been set in motion by small ones. She was working with Pete Ardmore on the west end of the property on a Sunday morning, which she was doing voluntarily because the fencing on that end needed attention before winter, and she had suggested it and Kessler had approved it, when Pete, who was 21 and had the specific quality of earnest transparency that comes with that age, said out of nowhere, "Mr. Crawford asked Kessler last week if you were happy here." Jane kept her eyes on the fence post she was examining. "Did he?" "Kessler told him you were the best hand he'd had in 3 years, Pete said, with the tone of someone delivering significant news. "Mr. Crawford didn't say anything to that. He just nodded, but he looked—" Pete trailed off, clearly struggling with the vocabulary. "What did he look like?" Jane asked, and she was aware that she was asking with more investment than was strictly casual. "Like someone who had just been told something they were already hoping was true," Pete said, with a certainty that surprised her until she remembered that 21-year-olds in love, which Pete clearly was with a girl in town named Clara, were often acutely perceptive about the symptoms of the condition. She put her hand on the fence post and stood there for a moment in the August heat and the grasshopper sound of the Kansas summer, and thought about the walls Timothy Crawford had built, and why he had built them, and what it would cost both of them to acknowledge what was happening on either side of those walls. She thought about the dark past behind him, the betrayal that had followed him from Texas to Kansas, and was still following him in the form of Garrett Sloane's periodic unwelcome appearances. She thought about her own grief, which she did not believe she was still drowning in but which had changed her in permanent ways, made her simultaneously more guarded and more certain about what she valued. She thought about $11.40 and 4 ranchers, and the word pity spoken 14 feet away from where she knelt in the red Oklahoma dust. She thought about the word respect, which was what Timothy Crawford had given her from the first moment and continued to give her daily, and which was, she understood with a clarity that arrived slowly and then all at once, the thing she had been most starved for and had perhaps, in her grief, forgotten to require. Garrett Sloane came back in September. This time he came with a lawyer. Jane was in the office when she heard the horses in the yard, and she looked out the window and saw Sloane dismounting alongside a thin man in a city suit who carried a leather satchel with the careful importance of someone who believes his documents are weapons. She watched Timothy come out of the barn and stand in the yard to meet them, and she watched the conversation from the window, unable to hear it but able to read the posture of all 3 men with the accuracy of someone who had spent years reading situations quickly. The conversation was not long. The lawyer produced papers from the satchel. Timothy looked at them without touching them, which was itself a kind of answer. Sloane spoke with the performed reasonableness of a man who has rehearsed being reasonable and has not quite managed to make it look natural. Timothy said something brief and final and turned to go back to the barn. Sloane called something after him that made Timothy stop with his back still turned for a moment and then continue walking. The lawyer and Sloane rode away. Timothy came into the office 10 minutes later, and Jane did not pretend she had not been watching from the window, because pretending was not something either of them did. "Property claim," he said, setting the copy of the document he had apparently accepted on the desk beside her. "He's claiming a section of the north pasture was improperly registered in my name and properly belongs to a land purchase he made before I acquired the Harmon property." Jane looked at the document. "Is there any basis for it?" "No," he said, flatly and without hesitation. "The Harmon property was clear when I bought it. I have the original land surveys." "Then we find them," she said, "and we document the chain of ownership from the original territorial survey through Harmon to you, and we prepare a response that makes this claim look exactly as frivolous as it is." He looked at her and she felt the weight of his attention in a way she had been managing for weeks with deliberate professionalism. "You don't have to do this," he said. "It's not what I hired you for." "I know that. I'm offering." She paused, holding his gaze. "As a capable person who is good at this kind of documentation, which is what you hired." Something moved in his face. That careful, particular something she had been watching for weeks. The thing she had begun to understand was the slight, involuntary yielding of a wall that he had built at great personal cost and maintained with considerable discipline. "Thank you, Jane," he said. "Find me the original surveys," she said. "I'll start tonight." She spent the next 4 evenings at the desk in his office after the regular workday, building the documentation case with the methodical precision she had always brought to numbers, cross-referencing land surveys, deed records, and county registration files against the claims in Sloane's document. Timothy Crawford came in and out, bringing coffee, occasionally sitting on the other side of the desk to examine a particular document with her, and the evenings had a quality of collaborative quiet that she could not entirely describe. They were working. They were also something else. Both things were true simultaneously. On the 4th evening, she found the original territorial survey that conclusively established the North Pasture's boundaries prior to either the Harmon acquisition or anything Sloane might claim, and she sat back in the chair and said, "Got it." Timothy looked up from the document he was reading. "This survey predates your purchase and Harmon's purchase, and anything Sloane can produce," she said. "It establishes the boundary exactly where your deed says it is." Combined with the unbroken chain of ownership records, This claim has no standing whatsoever." He came around to her side of the desk and looked at the survey where she was pointing, leaning over her shoulder, and she was aware with every nerve she had that he was very close, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool evening air, and she kept her finger on the relevant section of the survey and her voice level and her breathing controlled. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's it," she agreed. He stayed very still for a moment, looking at the document, and then he said, also quietly and without moving away, "I want to tell you something." She waited. "When you came here in August," he said, "and said what you said, I knew about the other ranchers. I knew what Bellows and Holt and the others had offered you and why." She kept herself still. "How? Small county," he said. "Kessler hears things." He paused. "I want you to know that I was not offering work because I had heard about your situation. I was offering it because my head foreman was distracted and my north pasture needed attention and my accounts were a disaster and you told me you could do those things. That was the complete extent of my reasoning at the time." "At the time," she said carefully. He moved slightly, and she turned in the chair to look up at him, and he was looking at her with that open quality that only appeared in the evenings, the dropped wall, the interior briefly revealed. "The reasoning has become somewhat more complicated since then," he said. She said, "Mine too." The space between those three words and what followed was very small and very significant, and Jane would remember it for the rest of her life, not as a grand dramatic moment, but as the particular feeling of something that had been held under careful management finally being allowed to simply be. He said, "Is that a problem?" She thought about it honestly, because that was what they both deserved. She thought about Cole, whose death had been the architecture of this whole terrible, reconstructive year, and she thought about it without guilt because she understood that grief and love were not competitors, and that surviving loss did not mean betraying it. She thought about practical problems, about what Caldwell would say, about what it meant to be in love with the person who employed her. She thought about Timothy Crawford's wall and her own, and about how walls built for good reasons became prisons if you never examined the locks. "Not a problem," she said. "A complication I'm willing to navigate." His expression, which she had been reading with increasing accuracy over 2 months, did something she had not seen before. It simply relaxed, not the careful, controlled settling of a face managing itself, but the genuine easing of something that had been held too long. "I'd like to court you properly," he said, "if that's agreeable." The formal phrasing and the context of everything was so perfectly Timothy Crawford that she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was tight. "It's agreeable," she said, using his own word from their very first exchange, and she saw in his face that he recognized it. The following weeks had a different quality. The work did not change. She was still at the fence lines and in the accounts and moving cattle, still doing the job she was being paid to do with the same competence she had always brought to it, but the margins of the workday became different. He rode out to check the south fence on a Saturday and asked if she wanted to come, not as a work task but with a plainness that meant something else, and she went. And they rode for 3 hours in the September gold with very little conversation, but a quality of companionship that was its own kind of eloquence. He took her to the Saturday social at the town hall in October, which was the first one she had attended since Cole's death, and she stood beside him while various members of Caldwell's community made their assessments with varying degrees of subtlety, and he did not perform anything for the audience. He simply stood beside her with the same quiet self-possession he brought to everything, and when old Gerald Bellows came over with his elaborate congratulatory bonhomie, Timothy acknowledged him with the minimum courtesy required and did not amplify it, which Jane found enormously satisfying. Emma Kessler took one look at them standing together and pulled Jane aside within the first hour to say, "I knew it. Bill said I was imagining it and I was not imagining it," with a warm, triumphant satisfaction. "You were not imagining it," Jane confirmed. "He's been different since you came," Emma said more seriously. "Less closed in, like he's remembered something. Jane thought about that on the ride home. She thought about people who closed themselves in after betrayal and what it meant to let someone past those walls, the risk and the cost, and the specific bravery of it. She thought about Timothy Crawford, who had given her work out of simple professional respect and had not known, in that first moment, that the woman he was being matter-of-fact with had spent 2 weeks being handled like something breakable and was starving for exactly the kind of uncomplicated regard he had offered. She thought about how things that mattered often began in the most ordinary way. Sloane made one more move in November. The letter arrived at the Crawford ranch addressed to Timothy, and Jane recognized Sloane's name on the envelope because she had been doing enough research on the man to know his handwriting. She put it on Timothy's desk and did not touch it further. That evening Timothy read it and set it down and told her what it said with the directness that was one of the things she had come to trust most deeply about him. Sloane was offering to drop the property claim in exchange for a payment that was, in Timothy's word, extortionate, and which Sloane was framing as a settlement for old disputes going back to the Abilene partnership. "What do you want to do?" Jane asked. "Fight it," he said, without hesitation. "We have the documentation. The claim has no standing. I'm not paying a man to stop harassing me because giving him money teaches him that harassment is profitable." "Then we fight it," she said. "I'll have everything ready for the county attorney by Thursday." The look he gave her then was not the professional regard she had catalogued in August, not the clean acknowledgement of competent work. It was something considerably warmer and more complicated, something that she suspected matched her own expression exactly. The legal response was delivered Thursday. The county attorney reviewed it and described the documentation as comprehensive. The case was heard in December before the county judge in Caldwell, a straightforward proceeding that went in Timothy's favor so clearly that Sloane's lawyer did not even make a vigorous argument. Sloane sat in the courtroom with the studied nonchalance of a man who has lost more gracefully than he deserved to, and afterward rode out of Caldwell in the direction he had come from. Jane watched him go from the steps of the courthouse with Timothy standing beside her, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a problem thoroughly resolved and a threat genuinely ended, not deferred, not managed, but finished. "He'll find another angle eventually," Timothy said. "Let him find it," she said. "We'll be ready." He looked at her. She had said "we" without thinking about it, and they both understood what the word meant, what it was claiming, what shape it was drawing around the future. "Jane," he said. "I know," she said. He took her hand, right there on the courthouse steps in downtown Caldwell with half the county available to witness it, and the gesture was so simple and so deliberate and so entirely Timothy Crawford that she felt it move through her like a sound. Christmas in 1882 was the first one she had not dreaded in a year. Emma Kessler hosted a supper at the foreman's house, and the whole ranch gathered, the hands and their families where they had them, and the table was loud and warm, and baby Daniel, who was now 4 months old and had recently discovered that faces were interesting, held court from Emma's lap with a benign authority. Pete Ardmore's girl Clara came, and Pete could not stop smiling, which was delightful and barely manageable in a 21-year-old. And Jane thought, watching him, about the particular generosity of young love that doesn't know yet what it might cost and loves anyway. She sat beside Timothy at the long table, and at some point in the middle of the meal his hand found hers under the table and stayed there, and she thought about August and the dust and $11.40 and the word pity and the word respect. And she thought that the distance between those two words, the whole landscape of this year, had brought her to this table, to this man's hand warm around hers, to this specific December evening that smelled of pine and roasting meat and snow coming in from the northwest. After supper, walking back toward the main house in the cold, clear night, their breath making small clouds in the December dark, he stopped her at the gate that led into the yard and turned to face her and said, "I want to ask you something." Her heart did something complicated. "I'm going to ask it plainly," he said, because I've found that's the only way I know how to ask things, and I don't want to start now being something I'm not." "Then ask it plainly," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want you to be my wife, and I want this to be your ranch as much as it's mine, and I want to build something here that's genuinely shared. I'm not asking out of any sense of what's expected or what the town will think. I'm asking because you are the most capable, honest, and necessary person in my life, and because I love you, and because life in your company is considerably better than life without it." He paused. "Those are the plain reasons." Jane looked at him in the dark December night. This private, careful, fundamentally decent man who had given her work because he needed work done, and had fallen in love with her through the dailiness of respect and the slow dissolution of walls. And she felt something that she could only describe as the exact opposite of being handled like something breakable. He was asking her as an equal. He was offering her a partnership. He was loving her the way he did everything, directly and without performance and with his whole measured, genuine self. "Yes," she said, "for equally plain reasons. I love you, and this ranch is already home to me, and the idea of the alternative is considerably less appealing than it was 4 months ago." He laughed, and it was the same laugh she had first heard from the office on a Thursday evening, surprised and genuine and absolutely unguarded, and she thought she would never tire of being the person who generated that sound. He kissed her in the December dark at the gate to the ranch yard that was going to be their ranch yard, and it was uncomplicated and warm, and nothing about it was pity. They married in March of 1883 at the Caldwell Methodist Church on a day that could not make up its mind about the weather, and delivered sun, clouds, and a brief vigorous rain, all within the span of 2 hours. Emma Kessler cried with the wholehearted commitment of someone who had been waiting for this to happen since October. Pete Ardmore, who had asked Clara to marry him at New Year's and been said yes to, stood in the back of the church with an expression of total vindication. Bill Kessler shook Timothy's hand with the economy of a man who considers emotion a private matter, and then immediately had to blow his nose, which somewhat undermined the economy. Jane wore a dress she had made herself from the plain cotton fabric she had not actually needed that day at Finch's dry goods store, the bolt she had reached for as a pretext while gathering information about Garrett Sloane, which made it, she thought, an appropriately symbolic garment. It was cream-colored with small tucks at the collar, and it was, by every practical measure, a sensible dress for a working ranch woman who was also today a bride. She stood next to Timothy Crawford at the front of the Methodist church, and said the words that had been said in that church before her many times, and meant them entirely and without complication, and he said his with the directness she had come to understand was the most intimate thing about him, his capacity to mean what he said and say only what he meant. After the ceremony, they hosted a dinner at the ranch. The main house, which Jane had by now reorganized with the same methodical efficiency she brought to the accounts, was crowded and warm and full of the sound of people who knew each other well enough to be comfortable. Someone produced a fiddle. Someone else produced a harmonica. The furniture in the sitting room was pushed to the walls, and there was dancing, which Timothy did not do, making Jane laugh for 5 minutes, and which she did, with Pete and Bill, and eventually the fiddle player himself, who was an elderly hand named Marcus, whose capacity for the Virginia reel proved apparently inexhaustible. That night, after the guests had gone, they sat together on the porch of the house that was now hers as much as his in the cold March dark, and the county was quiet around them, and Jane said, "I want to put money into the North Pasture infrastructure this spring. There's an irrigation possibility I've been thinking about." Timothy said, "Tell me," she told him. He listened with his full attention, the way he always listened, and then they talked about it for an hour, 2 people building something together in the dark, and it was, she thought, exactly what marriage should be. The spring came, and with it the work of their first full season together as partners in every sense. Jane's management of the accounts and her work on the cattle operations had already improved the ranch's efficiency in measurable ways, and by summer they were running 160 head and had hired 2 additional hands, bringing the total crew to 9. The North Pasture Irrigation Project, which she had sketched out over the winter with help from a pamphlet she had found at the county agricultural office, proved sound in practice, and the North grass came up thick and early that year. She and Emma Kessler had developed by now the comfortable, deep friendship of women who have found in each other something rare, genuine mutual recognition. They spent mornings together when the workload allowed, and baby Daniel grew from a sleepy, generalized infant into a mobile, opinionated small person with strong views about horses, which he had recently discovered. In August, 1 year after the day she had first ridden down the slope to the Crawford property and found Timothy Crawford at the corral fence, Jane discovered she was pregnant. She told him on a Thursday evening in the office, sitting across the desk from him in the exact arrangement they had been in 100 times, because there was something right about telling him that way, in the room where so much of their partnership had first been established, and because she wanted to see his face without any theatrical setting around it. He went very still for a moment, the way he sometimes went still when something significant had landed. Then he said, "Are you well?" "Perfectly well," she said. "Good," he said, and then more quietly, "Good." The expression on his face was one she had not catalogued before because she had not had occasion to see it. It was joy, unmanaged and complete, the kind that finds a man before he has time to contain it. She would remember it all her life, the way the lamplight caught it, the way it transformed his ordinarily composed features into something completely open. He came around the desk and she stood to meet him, and he held her with a care that was also its own kind of strength, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed in the familiar scent of him, wood smoke and leather, and the particular cleanness of a man who does hard work in honest air. "A baby," he said, in a tone that treated the word as though it were new and extraordinary, which she supposed it was. "A baby," she confirmed. The pregnancy proceeded without serious difficulty, which Jane attributed partly to constitution and partly to the fact that she refused to be treated as fragile, a position she defended on multiple occasions against Emma's affectionate concern and the slightly alarmed solicitude of Timothy, who had apparently taken to consulting every available text on the subject of pregnancy and had concluded that she should be resting more than she was. "I feel fine," she told him in October when he suggested she let Pete handle the fence inspection she was heading out to do. "The book says that in the later months." "The book was probably written by a man who has never been pregnant," she said, which he could not refute. "And I have ridden horseback and mended fence through an August heat wave and feel perfectly well, and am going to check the east fence." He let her go, because he respected her judgment even when he was worried about her, which was one of the things she loved most about him. She did let Pete handle the more physical work as December arrived, and the snow came down heavy across the Kansas plains, and the days shortened to brief bright windows between long cold nights. She worked the accounts and managed the herd records and read and talked with Emma, and planned the modifications to the cookhouse that she had been thinking about since spring, and she let Timothy be quietly, carefully attentive in the way that was entirely his own, neither hovering nor pretending not to notice, but present in the particular way he had always been present, with the steady attention that she had come to think of as the essential quality of his love. Their son was born on the 5th of January, 1884, during a snowstorm that made the county look like the interior of a cloud. He arrived in the late afternoon with considerable noise and a great deal of dark hair, and when Jane first held him in the lamplight of their bedroom with Timothy sitting on the edge of the bed beside her, his hand warm against her back, she felt the peculiar, overwhelming completeness of a moment so large that it exceeds all available language. "Henry," Timothy said, which was the name they had agreed on months ago. Henry, Jane said, looking down at this small, definite, loudly present person who was both entirely theirs and entirely his own. Henry Crawford. Henry Crawford proved to be a child of strong opinions and robust health who was fascinated by horses before he could walk properly, and who had, from a very early age, his father's quality of serious attention and his mother's quality of getting things done. By the time he was 2, he was being carried on Ada's back by his delighted mother, and by the time he was 3, he was attempting to give instructions to the ranch hands in a tone that Pete Ardmore described as unnervingly authoritative. The ranch continued to grow with the steady, deliberate quality that characterized everything Timothy Crawford did. By 1885, they were running 200 head, and had purchased the adjacent Henderson property when old Will Henderson retired to live with his daughter in Wichita, which extended the Crawford land into the low eastern hills and added significant acreage to their grazing range. Jane managed the integration of the new property's accounts and organization with her usual efficiency, and within a season the Henderson land was operating as seamlessly as the original property. Garrett Sloan never came back. She heard from Albert Finch, who continued to be an excellent source of county intelligence, that Sloan had encountered legal difficulties in Texas the previous year arising from his land speculation activities, and that his ability to conduct harassment operations in Kansas had been somewhat curtailed by his need to manage problems considerably closer to home. Timothy heard this with the same equanimity with which he received most news, neither triumphant nor entirely unsurprised, and she thought it closed a chapter in him that had been kept open by the persistent threat of the man's return. In the spring of 1886, Jane discovered she was pregnant again. She told Timothy on the porch this time, in the April evening with the first warm breath of the year coming across the hills and Henry asleep inside, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, that complete and unmanaged joy, and she laughed at him affectionately, and he laughed back, and they sat together in the spring dark and were simply happy. Their daughter, born in October of 1886 on a bright fall day that smelled of cut grass and coming cold, was named Catherine, and she arrived into the world with Jane's precise set of features and what Emma Kessler, present for the occasion, described as an expression of determined assessment that was absolutely Jane Slater to the bone. Crawford, Jane corrected, holding the baby. Jane Crawford. Emma waved her hand. You're Jane Slater Crawford, and we all know it, and so I predict is she. Catherine proved Emma's prediction accurate with remarkable speed. She was a child who noticed everything, who cataloged and considered with an intensity of focus that sometimes stopped the adults around her into the slightly self-conscious awareness of being studied. She and Henry, who was 3 when she was born, developed between them the specific language of siblings who are genuinely interested in each other, and Timothy and Jane would later say that watching their children together was one of the great, continuous pleasures of their lives. The years that followed had the quality of a well-built structure, solid, maintained, expanded thoughtfully. The Crawford Ranch became one of the most productive operations in the county, not through luck or a single dramatic windfall, but through the combination of competent management, honest dealing, and the particular kind of consistent, attentive effort that 2 people apply when they are genuinely invested in a shared enterprise. Jane and Timothy had their arguments, because 2 people with strong views and the habit of plain speaking necessarily do, and their arguments had the quality of their other interactions, direct, honest, and resolved. They disagreed about the expansion eastward in 1887 and spent 3 evenings with the account spread between them before arriving at a compromise position that, as it turned out, proved correct. They disagreed about whether Henry at age 5 was old enough to be involved in certain ranch work alongside the hands, and resolved this by establishing specific graduated responsibilities that satisfied both Timothy's caution and Jane's conviction that children learn by doing. They never went to bed on the unresolved side of an argument, because early in their marriage Jane had made this a rule, and Timothy, who liked rules he could see the logic of, had agreed to it without reservation. In the spring of 1889, Pete Ardmore, who had been a Crawford hand for 7 years, came to Timothy and said that he and Clara had been saving and were thinking of starting their own operation, but that he felt he owed it to give Crawford the first chance at keeping him. Timothy told him that the first chance at keeping him was a raise and the offer of senior hand status with corresponding responsibilities and pay, and Pete stayed. And 2 years later his wife, Clara, had a baby girl they named after Emma Kessler, which was the kind of thing that happened in small communities built on genuine mutual regard. Bill Kessler's Daniel grew up alongside Henry Crawford, and the two of them were inseparable in the way that boys who grow up sharing the same geography and the same values become. And when Daniel was older and began to show the precise practical intelligence of his father, Timothy offered him a position as a junior hand, and Bill accepted on his son's behalf with an expression that he managed to keep relatively controlled, which was more than he had managed at the wedding. Jane turned 35 in 1891 and found the age agreeable. She had come through the decade that had begun with $11.40 and a word spoken across 15 feet of red dust, and had arrived here, a working ranch that she had helped build and continued to help run, 2 children who were healthy and interesting, and becoming their own people with considerable speed, a marriage that had the quality of a thing constructed with care and lived in honestly. She had her friendship with Emma and her competent working relationships with every hand on the property and her accounts, which were models of the kind, cross-referenced and annotated and accurate to the last cent. She thought sometimes about the other ranchers, Bellows and Holt and Marsh and Bennett, about the careful architecture of their pity, about what their offers had been and what this had been, and she thought about the word respect the way you think about the word water when you have been thirsty a very long time. It was not, she understood, that Timothy Crawford had been trying to offer something unusual. He had simply been conducting a straightforward professional transaction based on genuine need and genuine assessment of capability. What made it extraordinary was only the contrast with everything that had preceded it, and what it had grown into was not the result of his intention in that first moment, but of everything that had followed, the dailiness of being treated as capable, the slow and mutual dissolution of carefully built walls, the particular chemistry of 2 private, practical people who had found in each other the specific thing they had most needed and had not known they were looking for. She was at the north pasture fence one October morning in 1891, checking the winter repairs she had asked Pete's crew to complete, when she heard Ada's particular footfall behind her, and turned to find Timothy riding up with 2 cups of coffee in the careful balancing act that he had perfected years ago, and that still made her smile without fail. He dismounted and handed her a cup and stood beside her looking at the north pasture in the October light, the grass gold and the hills beyond it blue with the atmospheric distance, and the Crawford cattle moving in the middle distance with the unhurried purpose of animals on good land well managed. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "The east section of the Henderson land. There's a valley there I've been considering for an orchard, apples, maybe some pear trees." She looked at him. "An orchard. Not primarily commercial," he said. "Partly for the household, partly because I'd like to." He paused. "And because Henry has been reading about apple cultivation in one of the agricultural journals and asked me about it twice this week." Jane laughed because Henry at 7½ had developed an enthusiasm for agricultural journals that was charming and slightly alarming in its specificity. "He asked me too," she said. "He had calculations." "I know, I saw them." She looked back at the pasture, an orchard. She thought about the river on her parents' Missouri farm, the one she had always meant to go back and see. She thought about the specific quality of permanence that fruit trees represented, the planting of something whose full benefit would be felt years down the road, the particular faith of it. "Let's plan an orchard," she said. He turned to look at her with that expression, the one she had catalogued that December night on the courthouse steps when she had said "we" without thinking, the expression that said she had once again arrived at exactly the center of something. She reached out and took his hand, the way he had taken hers on the courthouse steps all those years ago, simple and deliberate and in the full light of day with the Kansas County spread out around them. And they stood at the fence of their north pasture in the October morning and drank their coffee and thought about apples, and about the considerable distance between pity and respect, and about how a life built on the second and never the first was, in the end, a very good life to have built. The orchard went in that following spring, 20 apple trees and 6 pear trees on the gentle slope of the East Henderson Valley, planted in April while the ground was still cold enough to hold the roots well. Henry and Catherine both helped with the planting, and Catherine, who was 4.5 and had strong opinions about where things should go, created a small difficulty around the placement of the 3rd pear tree that was eventually resolved by Timothy deferring to her judgment, which Jane found deeply amusing and also characteristically right. The tree Catherine chose grew the most fruit of any of the pear trees. She mentioned this to anyone who would listen for years afterward. Ada grew old with the particular dignity of a horse who has done genuine work for a long time and has been well cared for throughout. When Ada finally died in the summer of 1892, on a warm July evening in her own stall with Jane sitting beside her, Jane cried with the uncomplicated directness of a person who does not believe in performing or suppressing genuine emotion, and Timothy sat with her for 2 hours in the barn without saying anything except what was occasionally necessary, which was exactly the right thing. They buried Ada near the line of cottonwoods on the east fence because that had been Ada's favorite section of fence to be walked along, which was a fact that Jane knew with certainty and that Timothy accepted without question. Jane found a new horse that fall, a gray mare from a breeding operation near Wichita that had Ada's quality of intelligent attention without Ada's particular stubbornness about creek crossings, and named her Clara after Pete Ardmore's wife, which Clara Ardmore found enormously flattering, and Pete found either complimentary or concerning, depending on his mood. The following years brought the ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of a life in progress. Henry grew into a young man of 15 with his father's methodical intelligence and a capacity for the practical application of theoretical knowledge that had Kessler saying repeatedly that Timothy should consider a formal agricultural education. And Timothy and Jane discussed this over many evenings and determined that they would support whatever direction Henry chose. Catherine, at 12, had developed a friendship with the county schoolteacher, a young woman from Kansas City named Margaret Walsh, who had arrived in Caldwell in 1893, and who recognized in Catherine the specific combination of intellectual rigor and practical capability that required and deserved proper cultivation. Margaret Walsh became a fixture in the Crawford household and in Jane's personal regard, and their conversations over supper were some of the most stimulating Jane could recall. In 1895, when Henry was 12 and old enough to be involved in the bookkeeping as a learning exercise, Jane began teaching him the accounts. He was a quick student with the instinctive precision of someone to whom numbers make natural sense, and within a season he was checking her reconciliations and occasionally finding small errors she had not caught, which she acknowledged without embarrassment because accurate accounts mattered more than personal pride. Timothy watched these sessions from the doorway of the office sometimes, this ritual of a competent woman teaching the next generation of the thing she had built, and the expression on his face on those evenings was one that needed no cataloging. Jane knew it completely. It was the same expression she had on her own face in quiet moments when she looked at the ranch they had built together from the austere starting point of a straightforward professional transaction and a word: gratitude. Deep, unhurried, daily gratitude for the particular accident and intention that had brought this specific life into being. She thought, on those evenings, about the women in Caldwell who had looked at her in 1882 with the particular concern of people who are calculating your chances. She thought about Mrs. Parrish's boarding house and the small room and the $11.40. She thought about Cole, whom she still loved with the faithful, non-competing love of someone who knows that people are not replaced, but that the heart has more room than grief initially allows. She thought about Gerald Bellows saying "poor creature" in that careful, low voice, and about the man she had met at the corral fence the next morning who had said, "What can I do for you?" with the clean simplicity of someone who had not yet decided what she was. She thought that Bellows had been wrong in the most fundamental possible way. She had not been a poor creature. She had been a competent woman with $11.40 and an excellent horse and a considerable store of knowledge and capability that had required only someone to ask for it honestly to begin doing exactly what it had been built to do. The pity had never been needed. The respect had been sufficient. It had been more than sufficient. It had been, in the end, the seed of everything. Jane Crawford, who had been Jane Slater, closed the accounts ledger on an October evening in 1895 and went to find her husband, who was on the porch in the cooling evening as she had known he would be, looking at the hills in the last light, and she sat down beside him, and he put his arm around her, and the ranch lay before them in the October gold, the barns and the corral and the cattle in the north pasture, and the faint dark line of the orchard on the eastern slope. And her children's voices came from inside the house, where Henry was explaining something to Catherine with characteristic thoroughness. "Happy?" Timothy asked. He asked it simply and directly, the way he asked everything. "Completely," she said, the way she answered everything. The October dark came down soft and full over the Crawford ranch, over the north pasture grass and the apple trees and the horses in the corral and the lamplight in the windows, over two people sitting on a porch in the final warmth of the year, the particular warmth of a life built honestly and held with both hands, and the Kansas night spread itself out all around them, wide and quiet and thoroughly, completely theirs.